Hoch mit Mut voran marschieren die Preußen, Mann, es gibt die.
Welcome to Nationalist Book Reviews. This channel is dedicated to uncovering and reviewing the books that the modern world wants you to forget, works that defend European identity, national pride, cultural heritage, and the unapologetic truth about our history and our people. Here, we examine the books that help shape nationalist consciousness and European identity, the ones mainstream historians either ignore or actively try to bury. Today on Nationalist Book Reviews, we're taking to the skies with a most interesting eyewitness account from the inner circle of the Third Reich. I was Hitler's pilot, the Memoirs of Hans Baur. Hans Baur was Adolf Hitler's personal pilot for over 12 years, from 1932 right until the final days in the Führerbunker in 1945. As commander of the Führer's flight squadron, Baur flew Hitler across Germany and Europe in his private aircraft, logging thousands of flight hours in some of the most critical moments of the war. He was one of the very last people to speak with Hitler before the suicide on the 30th of April 1945, and he remained loyal until the bitter end. Not a single line bends toward apology, nor bows to the expectations of the Allies. It's the straightforward, no-nonsense testimony of a tough, highly skilled German aviator and soldier who served his Führer with absolute loyalty and remained resolute despite the heavy cost, including years of Soviet torture and imprisonment. In this review, we'll examine what Baur actually reveals about Hitler the man, life inside the inner circle, the final days in Berlin, and the horrific Soviet captivity that followed. If you're tired of the Hollywood fantasies and want the raw truth from the man who literally flew Adolf Hitler through the most dramatic years of the 20th century, you're in the right place. So, what the book is and isn't. Let there be no confusion from the outset about what I Was Hitler's Pilot is, and what it most certainly is not. The book does not delve into political or ideological ideas. There is no self-flagellating post-war memoir groveling for forgiveness. And Baur does not give into too much technical stuff about flights or routines, although it does touch upon certain experiences while flying. But mainly what it is the raw, gripping memoir of a battle-hardened German pilot who served as Adolf Hitler's personal aviator for over a decade. Hans Baur gives us an insider's view from the cockpit, interesting flights with certain figureheads, tense wartime missions, the private conversations with Hitler at altitude, and the chaotic final days in Berlin. The book is packed with vivid, no-nonsense details. Baur's close relationship with Hitler, the atmosphere inside the inner circle, the immense pressure of command during the war, and most powerfully, the brutal reality of Soviet captivity after the collapse. Baur doesn't sugarcoat anything. He describes the torture, the interrogations, the starvation, and the years in Soviet prisons and camps with stark honesty. What the book isn't is comfortable reading for those who want the cartoon villain version of history. Baur never denounces Hitler. He never claims he was brainwashed. He simply tells what he saw and lived, a loyal German doing his duty to the end. If you're looking for deep ideological analysis, then you might need to look into other sources. If you want another tearful, I should have known better confession, this isn't it. But if you want the unfiltered testimony of the man who flew Adolf Hitler through victory and defeat, and then survived hell, then I Was Hitler's Pilot is essential reading. Books like these shed light on the perspective of the defeatist, not only illuminate how events truly unfolded, but also unveil countless truths that mainstream historians have deliberately concealed from us. So who was Hans Baur? Hans Baur was Adolf Hitler's personal pilot for over 12 years, one of the most trusted and loyal men in the entire inner circle of the Third Reich. Born in 1897, Baur joined the German army at the outbreak of World War I and quickly became a combat pilot. He flew dangerous reconnaissance and fighter missions on the Western Front, earning the Iron Cross and a reputation as a skilled and courageous aviator. After the war, he transitioned into civil aviation, becoming one of Germany's most experienced commercial pilots during the chaotic Weimar years. An interesting fact, Baur was one of the first to receive the golden pin that was introduced by the Lufthansa, German Aviation Company in 1927 for completing a distance of an astonishing 400,000 kilometers. In 1932, Baur first flew Adolf Hitler during the final push for power. After the National Socialists took control in 1933, he was appointed chief pilot of the Führer's flight squadron. For more than a decade, Baur was responsible for Hitler's safety in the air. He flew the Führer on thousands of missions across Germany and Europe, often in dangerous conditions. Baur was no desk-bound officer. He was a battle-hardened pilot who earned Hitler's complete confidence through professionalism, courage, and unwavering loyalty. He remained at his post until the very end, making dangerous flights into besieged Berlin in April 1945 and staying with Hitler in the Führerbunker during the final days. After the collapse, the Soviets captured Baur almost immediately. He was held in captivity for almost 10 years, a heavy price for simply doing his duty as a pilot and a soldier. Hans Baur was the man who literally kept Adolf Hitler airborne through the greatest triumphs and the final catastrophe of the Reich. His unique position gives his memoir a perspective almost no one else could provide. Now moving on to the historical context. When Hans Baur began flying Adolf Hitler in 1932, Germany was still reeling from the humiliation of the First World War and the crushing terms of the Treaty of Versailles. The country was economically devastated, politically unstable, and torn between competing extremist forces. National Socialism was rising as a movement promising to restore German sovereignty, national pride, and economic strength. By 1933, after Hitler became Chancellor, Baur was appointed chief pilot of the newly formed government flight squadron. Over the next 12 years, he became one of the most trusted men in Hitler's inner circle. He flew the Führer across Germany during the triumphant years of recovery and rearmament, during the rapid victories of 1939 and 1941, and later through the darkening skies of total war. Baur piloted Hitler on countless missions aboard the famous Condor and Ju-52 aircraft, often under dangerous conditions. The turning point came with the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. What was intended as a swift campaign, a preventative war to destroy Bolshevism, but which turned into the largest and bloodiest land war in history. As the Eastern Front consumed even more German blood and resources, and as the Western Allies intensified their strategic bombing campaign against German cities, the strain on the leadership became immense. By 1944 and 1945, the Reich was fighting a desperate two-front war against overwhelming material superiority. Baur continued flying dangerous missions, including repeated flights into encircled Berlin as the Red Army closed in. The final weeks saw the once mighty German capital reduced to rubble, with Soviet forces fighting street by street toward the Reich's chancellery. When the end came in late April 1945, Baur was amongst the small group still with Hitler in the Führerbunker. After Hitler's suicide on the 30th of April, Baur attempted to organize escape flights for remaining personnel, but it was too late. Captured almost immediately by Soviet forces, he became a high-valued prisoner precisely because of his closeness to Hitler. What followed was years of brutal Soviet captivity. Baur endured repeated torture and interrogation aimed at extracting confessions or information about Hitler's possible escape. He spent long periods in solitary confinement and harsh labor camps, a fate shared by many loyal German officers and soldiers who refused to break. This is the real historical backdrop of I Was Hitler's Pilot, the dramatic arc of Germany's rise under National Socialism, the total war that consumed the continent, the final collapse in Berlin, and the savage retribution that followed under Soviet occupation. Baur's memoir stands as a first-hand account from a man who was not only present for the entire journey, but who paid one of the heaviest personal prices for his loyalty. Now moving on to core observations, Hans Baur does not write a detailed analysis of what National Socialism is or critiques about the party. Instead, he delivers something raw and quite powerful, the straightforward observations of a professional pilot who spent over 12 years in extremely close proximity to Adolf Hitler in social events, in the air, and in the final bunker. The central observation that runs through the entire book is this: Adolf Hitler was a calm, disciplined, and highly focused leader who treated those who served him with respect and loyalty. Baur repeatedly describes Hitler as courteous, thoughtful, and remarkably composed even under enormous pressure. He was not the screaming, irrational figure portrayed in post-war films. In the cockpit and during long flights, Hitler was often relaxed, interested in technical details about the aircraft, and engaged in everyday conversations. A second key observation is the immense burden of command that Hitler carried, especially after the invasion of the Soviet Union. Baur watched the strain grow visibly as the war on the Eastern Front turned into a meat grinder. He describes the long nights of work, the endless military conferences, and the growing realism in Hitler's assessments as victory became more distant. Yet even in the hardest times, Baur notes that Hitler maintained his composure and concern for the people around him. Baur also gives a vivid picture of life inside the inner circle from a pilot's perspective. He describes the atmosphere within the party, the tension of wartime flights, and the loyalty that bound the small group of men who remained with Hitler until the end. His account of the final days in Berlin is particularly gripping. The dangerous flights into the besieged capital, the chaos on the ground, and the last conversation with Hitler before the suicide on the 30th of April 1945. Perhaps the most powerful observations come in the second half of the book, Baur's brutally honest account of Soviet captivity. The Soviets subjected him to years of savage interrogation and torture in an attempt to force him to admit that Hitler had escaped or to extract every possible detail about the Führer's last days. He endured repeated beatings, sleep deprivation, solitary confinement in freezing cells, and psychological pressure designed to break even the strongest men. Baur describes being moved between prisons and labor camps, suffering from malnutrition, disease, and constant humiliation. At one point, he was told he would be executed if he did not confess what the Soviets wanted to hear. Through it all, Baur refused to lie or betray his former commander. His loyalty remained intact even when his body was broken and his future looked hopeless. These chapters are some of the most raw and sobering in any Third Reich memoir, a stark reminder of the real face of victor's justice that awaited loyal German soldiers after 1945. Importantly, Baur never claims to have known every political secret. His focus stays on what he personally experienced, flying the Führer, observing his character under pressure, and then enduring the consequences of that loyalty. He writes as a soldier and pilot, practical, direct, and unemotional. These core observations make the book so valuable and so inconvenient for the official narrative. At the same time, his detailed account of Soviet brutality stands as a powerful testimony to the savage retribution that followed Germany's defeat. In the end, Hans Baur's memoir is the testimony of a man who did his duty to the end, remained loyal even when it cost him everything, and refused to rewrite his past to please his captors. Now moving on to the rhetorical analysis, Hans Baur was a pilot, not a writer, and that's exactly what makes his rhetoric so effective. He writes with the direct, matter-of-fact style of a seasoned aviator filling a flight report, short sentences, direct language, no flowery prose, no philosophical detours, and absolutely no groveling for forgiveness. Baur tells his story the way a combat pilot would, straight, practical, and unflinching. This straightforward tone gives the book tremendous credibility. When he describes flying Hitler through turbulent skies or navigating dangerous missions, you feel the tension in the cockpit. When he recounts the final chaotic flights into encircled Berlin, the danger is palpable. And when he moves into the Soviet captivity chapters, the style becomes even starker, cold, brutal, and stripped of emotion. He doesn't dramatize his suffering. He simply reports it. That restraint makes the horror feel realistic. Baur's rhetorical strength lies in what he refuses to do. He never engages in the post-war ritual of self-condemnation. There is no "I should have known better" or sudden moral awakening. Even after years of Soviet torture, he does not denounce Hitler or apologizes for his service. He simply says, "This is what happened, this is what I saw, and this is what I endured." That quiet refusal to betray his loyalty is one of the most powerful aspects of the book. Another effective technique is Baur's focus on the technical and personal. He describes aircraft, flight conditions, and Hitler's reaction to them with the eye of a professional. He notes how Hitler was interested in the mechanics of flying, how he behaved under stress during long flights, and how he treated the flight crew. These small, concrete details make the portrait of Hitler feel authentic and human rather than mythical. The Soviet captivity section is where Baur's rhetoric becomes more devastating. He doesn't sensationalize the torture and deprivation. He states the facts plainly: the beatings, the sleep deprivation, the solitary confinement, the constant pressure to confess that Hitler had escaped. The simplicity of this language makes the reality even more shocking. There is no self-pity, just the calm report of a soldier who survived hell and refused to break. In short, Baur's rhetorical style is that of a loyal German pilot writing a debrief, clear, honest, and unapologetic. He doesn't preach. He doesn't beg for understanding. He simply delivers his testimony from the cockpit and from the prison cell. That unvarnished honesty is precisely why "I Was Hitler's Pilot" remains so dangerous to the official narrative. In a sea of memoirs that bend the knee to the victors, Baur's plain-spoken account stands out as a rare act of defiance. Now moving on to some key quotes and interesting passages. Hans Baur, "I Was Hitler's Pilot," is packed with raw, no-nonsense observations. Here are some interesting ones which I have chosen for this book review. As we turn to Chapter 2, we are introduced to an interesting fact. Hans Baur mentions that on the 15th of January 1919, the first military airmail service was introduced in Germany. Further in Chapter 2, Baur states that his first crowned head of state, which he flew, was King Boris of Bulgaria. As we read further in Chapter 3, Baur reflects on the high level of confidence and personal relationship he had with Hitler. The next passage I will quote is found on page 38 of Chapter 3, and I quote Baur: "Hitler's complete confidence in me led by this time to a more intimate and friendly relationship. After all, again and again his life depended on my skill, and he realized that I always did my level best for him. So one day he told me that henceforth I was to consider myself as his personal friend and permanent guest, as well as his pilot. From now on, I was to be allowed to go in and out of his house and of the Reich Chancellery whenever I liked, without special pass or permission." End quote. Baur also describes his feeling about Eva Braun's relationship with Hitler. He regards her relationship with Hitler as the most human aspect he knows about Hitler, suggesting that he perceives it as a genuine and personal connection that reveals a different, more relatable side of Hitler's character. The next passage on page 45 of Chapter 3 is a reflection of that feeling, and I quote Baur: "I had already heard a good deal of Eva Braun before I met her. So many people her relationship to Hitler was a surprise, and so to some a disappointment. But for me, it represented perhaps the most human thing I knew about Hitler." End quote. Baur would often describe that during the long flights, Hitler would often sit in the cockpit with him. He was interested in every detail of the aircraft and the flight. He also treated the crew with great respect. As the final days approached, Baur is witness to the destruction that was engulfing Berlin. He offered to fly Hitler out, but Hitler did not want to. On page 124, Chapter 4, we come across a conversation between Baur and Hitler comments, and I quote: "The war will end with the fall of Berlin, and I stand or fall with Berlin. A man must summon up courage enough to face the consequences, and therefore I am ending it now. I know that tomorrow millions of people will curse me. That's fate." End quote. So we see Hitler is expressing his unwavering commitment to Berlin, believing that the war will ultimately be decided by its fall. He shows that he is prepared to accept the consequences of his decisions, even if they lead to his downfall, and acknowledges that many people will blame or curse him for what is to come. Further in the chapter, we read that Hitler had given Baur one final task to complete, which Baur accepts with no questions. Further on, we understand Hitler had a feeling of betrayal by his generals, and he mentions to Baur, and I quote Hitler, "On my tombstone, they ought to put the words, 'He was the victim of his generals.'" End quote. Moving on to the final chapter, this is where in the book we read about the torture and harsh conditions that Baur went through. If you have read Rochus Misch's memoirs, you will read the crossover between both Baur and Misch in captivity. Baur explains the torture he went through, and I quote, "We suffered 21 successive nights of interrogation from midnight until 5 o'clock in the morning, and when we got back to ourselves, we were not allowed to make up for the sleep we had lost. A favourite trick was to play one of us against each other, but when you asked to be confronted with the fellow who had allegedly said that or this about you, your examiner would always change the subject." End quote. Baur mentions that the Russians beat him repeatedly and kept him awake for days on end. They wanted Baur to say that Hitler had escaped. He told them the truth, that he saw him dead. And to reflect on this, Baur mentions, and I quote, "But they did not want the truth. They wanted a confession that suited their purposes." End quote. He mentions how the Russians were ingenious at concocting new methods of torture. At one moment, they even brought up his wife, and I quote, "Baur, you're going to tell us what you know now, or else. In a day or so your wife will be here, and if you don't talk then we'll rip her knickers off in front of you, and if that's not enough we'll turn her over and thrash her, and if even that doesn't loosen you up, we'll make her into a whore." End quote. In the end, no matter what they did, Baur stuck to the truth and never betrayed Hitler. After the reality of almost 10 years in Soviet imprisonment, Baur returned back to Germany. Baur found his return home after 10 years with a sense of unfamiliarity, as everything feels unexpectedly different and overwhelming. He mentions, and I quote, "It isn't easy to return home after 10 years. You are overjoyed, but everything is so new that things spring at you like a clumsy dog, almost bowling you over." End quote. Overall, even after years of torture, Baur's loyalty remained unbroken. These passages and quotes reflect a man who was with Hitler longer than almost anyone else and then paid one of the heaviest prices for that loyalty. Now moving on to critical evaluation, "I Was Hitler's Pilot" is a gripping and valuable memoir, but like all books, it has clear strengths and weaknesses. First, looking over the strengths, the book's greatest strength is its authenticity and unique perspective. Hans Baur was not a politician or an ideologue. He was a professional pilot who spent 12 years in the most intimate setting possible with Hitler, the cockpit. His descriptions of flying Hitler, getting to know him, and the final desperate flights into Berlin feel immediate and real. You get a sense of the tension, the danger, and the loyalty that bound the small group around Hitler in the last days. Baur's account of the Soviet captivity is one of the most powerful and sobering parts of any Third Reich memoir. He does not sensationalize his suffering. He simply reports the beatings, sleep deprivation, solitary confinement, and years of imprisonment with stark honesty. These chapters serve as a brutal reality of what the losers of the war faced. His refusal to break or falsely confess, even under extreme torture, is genuinely admirable. Baur's writing style is direct and unemotional, which adds credibility. He never tries to portray himself as a hero or a victim. He simply tells what he saw and what he endured as a soldier doing his duty. Now moving on to the weaknesses of the text. The main limitation is that Baur was a pilot, not a political insider. He rarely discusses high-level strategy, ideological debates, or the broader machinery of the party. His focus stays almost entirely on flying, personal interactions with Hitler, and his own experiences after capture. Readers looking for a deep analysis of National Socialist policy or military decision-making will need to look into other sources. Some people might emphasize that parts of the book might feel a little restrained, especially when describing Hitler. They might view this as a weakness because it might make the portrait of Hitler somewhat one-sided. I Was Hitler's Pilot is not a comprehensive history of the Third Reich, nor is it a deep ideological work. It is the honest testimony of a skilled German aviator who served his Führer loyally for 12 years. Its value lies in its rarity. A first-hand account from one of the last men to speak with Hitler, combined with a raw depiction of what liberation by the Red Army actually meant for captured Germans. On my final reflection of the book, I Was Hitler's Pilot, is more than just a memoir. It is the testimony of a man who flew at the very center of history and then survived hell for it. He was there for the rise, the triumphs, the long wartime flights, and the final desperate days in Berlin. He spoke with Hitler in the cockpit and in the bunker. He remained loyal to the end. And for that loyalty that was justified for the greater good, he spent years of Soviet torture, interrogation, solitary confinement, and imprisonment. What makes this book powerful is Baur's refusal to break, even under extreme pressure. He never denounced Hitler. He never apologized for his service. He never rewrote his past to satisfy his captors. He simply told the truth as he lived it, a professional German pilot who did his duty with skill and honor. In a time when every German connected to Hitler is expected to spit on his memory and beg for forgiveness, Baur's calm, unapologetic voice stands out like a beacon. His memoir cuts through decades of Hollywood caricature and victor's propaganda. It shows Hitler as a real leader, composed, thoughtful, and respected by capable men like Baur, rather than the raving monster we've been fed for over 80 years. Hans Baur flew Adolf Hitler through the greatest highs and the darkest lows of the Reich. That kind of steadfast loyalty and honesty is rare, and in today's world of cowardice and historical erasure, it is worth honouring. If you want to understand the human reality behind the headlines, if you want to hear from a man who was with Hitler until the very end and then survived Soviet hell, then I Was Hitler's Pilot belongs on your shelf. I rate this book a solid 9.2 out of 10. The vivid imagery and the intense sense of atmosphere it creates are truly unforgettable and hard to find elsewhere. Get a copy, read it, pass it on. In an age that wants us to forget, books like this keep the truth alive. Thank you for listening today. I hope you enjoyed this review. In my next video, I'll be exploring a new book. If you enjoy this kind of content, please leave a like or a comment below, and make sure to subscribe for more. Stay safe and see you on the next video.
Die Fahne hoch mit Schwung voran marschieren die Preußen, Mann für Mann, es gibt die